What if rock and roll was never just about music? What if it was the echo of something far older? Older than radio, older than cities, even older than memory itself. What if it was a thread stretching back through time to secret rituals, masked ceremonies, and all to the beat of rhythms that once belonged to ancient gods? Let's enter the space where music became myth and myth starts sounding like music, here on Things Visible and Invisible. Christopher Knowles is an American writer, editor, and comics historian, best known for exploring pop culture through mythological and occult themes. He is the author of several books, including The Secret History of Rock and Roll, which claims rock music echoes ancient mystery religions and ritual traditions. And he joins me down the line from his home in New Jersey. Chris, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Chris, when I first came across your work, I was fascinated by it, but also began to scratch my head a little bit and thinking, really? Mystery religions, ancient mythic Greek myths, and rock and roll?
Yeah, well, it all started when I was very young and I was always reading rock magazines, and I'd always see this term Dionysian brought up. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? And you'd always hear this term assigned particularly to people like Jim Morrison, but also, Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones, and later Guns N' Roses, all these kinds of bands that, party animal type of bands. So that kind of stuck with me. And then in 1984, I saw the Clash play at Worcester Centrum in Massachusetts. And I kind of realized that there was something else going on here. And I started to think of the term shamanic quite a bit to try to describe the experience to people. And that's an experience I had quite a bit in my youth, in my wild youth. So I had done this book called Our Gods Wear Spandex. And in that, I divide all the major superheroes into certain archetypes: the Apollo archetype, the Golem archetype, the Amazon archetype, the Wizard archetype, and the Brotherhood archetype. And most superheroes, nearly all of them, can be fit into one of these categories, these archetypes. So I started to think more seriously about the rock and roll stuff. And I had been doing a lot of research into the mystery religions. And these are religions that people really kind of misunderstand, I believe. If you look at the mystery cult centers of the ancient Greek world, it was like going to Lollapalooza or Bonnaroo or Coachella. It really was. I mean, these were big festivals that people would come from all around the known world to attend, and that there would be music and bands and fireworks and pyrotechnics and drugs and sex and all these kind of things that you'd associate with like a Woodstock or Lollapalooza again, something like that. And I started looking more deeply into the actual music that was played. And I was like, my God, this is heavy metal. It was guys, there was a bunch of different names for them, dactyls, karits, corybantes, so on and so forth, that would dress up in hoplite armor, which is, traditional Greek armor, and play this music using their swords and shields as instruments, but also drums and these giant metallic stringed instruments. And they would have fights, and it was just wildness. And the Dionysian cults in particular were they got really out of control, particularly in the 2nd century BC in Rome. There was a huge crackdown on them. So the more I was reading about it, the more familiar it seemed to me. And I was like, this is just rock and roll. This is just, Glastonbury, whatever you have over there, Phoenix in the Park, I don't know, without electricity. The only difference is that there's no electricity. I mean, they were like, and even like raves in some regards. So, but the classic era of rock, say from the Beatles to Nirvana, that sort of 25-year period in there. The musicians were all fitting into, again, a rather small set of archetypes, Appollonian, that would be the Beatles, U2, Bruce Springsteen. Dionysian, as I mentioned before, that would be Led Zeppelin and The Doors and Guns N' Roses and so on. And then there were other ones like what I call the mysteries of Demeter, sort of the Earth Mother. And then the mysteries of Isis. You'd have Stevie Nicks, singers like who are more ethereal, a little bit more feminine than sort of these ass-kicking Earth Mother types like Tina Turner or Janis Joplin and so on. And then the heavy metal acts really align with like the Plutonian energy, Pluto, darkness, chthonic energy, right? And then you also have a correspondence with the Mithraic mysteries, very male-oriented, very militaristic, very severe. And that would be like a lot of the street punk and hardcore bands in that realm. And then you'd have like a parallel to the mysteries of Orpheus, where you'd have the sensitive singer-songwriters, Nick Drake, James Taylor. I mean, even including in some regards, Kurt Cobain. So I just realized that you could break down all the classic rock bands into these archetypes. So combine that with the fact that if you do the reading on the ancient mystery cults, they are Burning Man, Coachella. I mean, like I said, they were just these big festivals, and you'd have music and food and pyrotechnics and drugs and sex, like I said. I mean, nothing really changes. Only the technology changes. And if you look at the ancient world, particularly these bands, as I mentioned before, I was just like, this is Judas Priest. I mean, this is Iron Maiden. This is whomever. These are just picture like your typical 80s metal band all decked out in leather and spikes and all the rest of it. And that was what these bands were like. And it was just amazing to me. And I started tracing back how rock and roll in this country progressed. You have this mixture of sort of folk song, Celtic folk song, particularly in the Appalachians, Scots Irish folk song. And then it's sort of colliding with, black music, which is all sort of West African in origin, and you have the voodoo and the Santeria and all the rest of it. So I traced how this all developed and how there really was like a Lollapalooza during the Pilgrim days. It was this, actually, this is where I grew up. It was a part of Quincy, Massachusetts called Merrymount. And there was these rebel pilgrims, I guess you would call them, who had this big May Day festival at the park there. So it was just really fascinating to me because nothing really changes. And it was the same sort of realization I had when I was doing our Gods Wear Spandex. It's just like, we just keep recycling these archetypes, these myths, these stories, so on and so forth. The externals change and the technology changes, but the underlying human impulse does not change. So.
Well, before we get into that, and I'm absolutely fascinated, you've set it up wonderfully, Chris, if I may say. I think we better sort of navigate a little bit through this very, very interesting idea that you have about ancient mystery cults and what they represent, the gods, the mythic gods, and the gods that we talk about, the rock gods. We is part of our lexicon. We talk in that way. So I think what would be helpful, maybe, Chris, is to take one or two well-known rock acts and put them through that filter. And if you wouldn't mind then explaining to us then a little bit about what the Greek or the mythic equivalent means, how it looks, how it sounds, so people can reference that then with their rock gods, if I can put it like that. So I'd like to start with somebody who perhaps is the Zeus. He's certainly on Mount Olympus, and that's Elvis Presley. I mean, you can't get bigger than that. How do you interpret him in this paradigm that you have developed?
Oh, he's the original Apollo. He's the Apollo. I mean, Apollo became to be associated with the sun, but really Apollo was a god of music and prophecy and disease, interestingly enough, considering how Elvis died with all the drug abuse and the food abuse and so on. Elvis really is a classic Apollonian figure in my estimation. Populist, positivist, sexual, but not overly so. I mean, Elvis was very sexually provocative, but not in the same way that like Mick Jagger or David Bowie was. He's almost wholesome in that regard, but he also had a very strong tradition of Pentecostal Christianity, and which, when I was looking at Pentecostal Christianity, because I've always loved old time gospel music, the real stuff, the real hardcore stuff that's like, it's punk rock. It's all about just pure catharsis. And Elvis was very, very powerfully influenced by those traditions, Pentecostalism and so on, low church Christianity. And that gave him very much a dimension that I don't think somebody like, Chuck Berry would have, or, even people like Eddie Cochran or Gene Vincent. I mean, these people who I'm sure all grew up in the same religious traditions that Elvis did himself, but didn't clutch it to their bosom the way that Elvis did. So this to me is classic Apollonian. Now, Apollo did not have a mystery cult because Apollo is very much like the mainstream. He was the big guy, but he figures, Apollo sort of flits in and out of all the other mystery cults in one way or the other. So that's why I wanted to set aside an archetype, particularly for that, people who represent that Apollo energy. And to me, it's all energetic, it's all vibrational. It's something that you can't fake. It's something that you can't disguise. You are who you are. And all the guitars and the amplifiers and all the rest of it, the TV cameras, the movie cameras, they're just going to amplify your energy. It's not an energy. It's something that I think is inborn. And I think it was very much inborn in Elvis. Okay. I think he was who he was from birth, and he was never not going to be that person. I don't think that Elvis would have been singing in some low down, dirty Chicago blues band, something. He was very much of the people and of his people, really. And he came to represent, for a lot of people around the world, America, in the classic Americana sense, when you had that post-war period, say from the late 40s to the early 60s, where you had rock and roll, you had surf music, you had the beginnings of R&B and soul, you had all these things, all the great movie stars, television, Coca-Cola and pizza and hamburgers and French fries, all these kind of things that people saw as America, blue jeans, and Elvis, I think, fit very comfortably in all of these types of like what I call energies, and he seemed to embody them. Now, one thing I should say about the mystery cults that not a lot of people understand is that the whole point of the mystery cult, to go to these mystery rituals and celebrations, and like I said, it's basically Burning Man or Lollapalooza or whatever, was to embody the god, that you wanted to bring that energy into yourself. So people who were drawn to certain cults, mystery cults in the ancient Greco-Roman world, would do so because it fit their energy. You know what I'm saying? It fit their personality. It fit their whole presentation. And each one of the mysteries sort of catered to a different, I don't want to say a demographic, but maybe to a different set of tastes and different set of attitudes and so on. Like I said, the Dionysian cults would get really crazy. You'd have women who'd get so wild they would tear animals limb from limb and eat them raw. And I think a lot of it had to do with it was just that particularly for women in ancient Greece, they were basically chattel. I mean, many cases they weren't allowed to leave the house. I mean, if you look at ancient Greece, it really wasn't all that much different than like Afghanistan or a country like that today. So there was a lot of pent up energy, a lot of pent up aggression, a lot of pent up sexuality and so on. And that's why I think that it had such a powerful appeal. But Dionysus is a very complex character, a very, very complex character, and in some ways a very troublesome and
we'll come to that, Chris.
Unsavory character.
Yeah, we're going to come to the Dionysians in a moment, but I just want to stick with Elvis and Apollo because you've piqued my interest very much on this. I mean, you like all of us will have seen footage of Elvis through the years, his young Elvis, and then the resurrection of Elvis, if you like, in the late 60s and the kind of, the Vegas years of the glory years. When, watching that as I was recently, he does look like somebody from another planet. Do you know what I mean? And I mean that in the best possible way. He looks like nobody on this earth, and there is a quality to him, which, people have tried to analyze and talk about charisma, star quality, whatever you want to call it. But he has, and then his performance on stage is mesmerizing again. This is before he gets on the stage, he's mesmerizing. But I mean, when you watch that, Chris, and you think about your own thesis around this, I mean, is this confirmation, I guess I'm asking, of what you immediately sort of sensed back in the 1980s?
Yeah, I think so. But the interesting thing about Elvis as well is that he's become his own archetype. I mean, Elvis is an archetype now. You will compare people to Elvis. You have Elvis impersonators. You have basically a cottage industry to this day. I mean, we're talking 50 years now after his death, almost 50 years. And he continues to resonate. We don't really talk about Marlon Brando or James Dean or any of these types of rebellious figures from the 1950s. I mean, Elvis is still very relevant. And I think a lot of it has to do with, music being a much more universal language, I think, than cinema. Though Elvis, of course, did a lot of movies, right? He's just recently we had, I don't know if you got it over there, but there was a biopic, very well received biopic based on Priscilla Presley. And it was played by an actress by the name of Kaylee Spieni. And, it was a big film. And, Elvis is always a sell. He kind of represents what America was, and I think in some ways what America longs to be again. I mean, don't forget that Bill Clinton, his nickname, the Secret Service would always have nicknames for the presidents, and his nickname was Elvis. He clearly tried to embody that energy, and maybe in a certain way, in his own certain way. I mean, maybe John F. Kennedy did as well. I mean, Elvis was so potent. I mean, even though people tend to forget that he had a lot of peaks and valleys in his popularity. And you talked about the 68 comeback, and I can think of very few parallels for that in music history, where you just had this incredible resurrection of his career, because he'd been doing all these movies that weren't doing well, and all the rest of it. And he was a very troubled man, unfortunately. I mean, he had a very troubled life, and the great love of his life, at least from her perspective, was Anne Margaret, right? And she worship the ground he walked on, and he would not reciprocate. So there's a lot of tragedy there as well. I mean, it's just a great story, you know. The world is run by stories, and Elvis is such a great story with all his warts and all. But he has just tremendous. You know, I think he has almost. I don't want to say sort of perpetual or an unending appeal, but he certainly has a very strong appeal that lingers today.
Absolutely, and I don't think anybody would second guess you on that. I mean, he is a rock god, and it's interesting. We are discussing gods with a small g, obviously, but the gods of ancient times, and we have our own gods, and he's definitely one of them. Just moving it a little bit along, Chris, because Elvis, Apollo, absolutely, I can see it straight away. However, when you have, as the 1960s progressed, you had lots of groups, not least the Beatles and the Stones and the Who, etc. How does that fit into your ideas? You know, the idea is there a communal element to this, or do each of the members of the group represent certain archetypes, certain gods?
Well, I think with the group, it depends on who is the dominant personality or what is the essential gestalt of the group. So the Beatles were four equals, and they all, in one way or another, embodied that sort of what I call the Apollonian energy. You had, you know, John, who was sort of the intellectual poet type, and then you had Paul, who was just music just flowed from him like a fountain. You know, I mean, you think about all those great melodies he wrote. You know, even into the 80s, the man was just he still astonishes me. You know, when I grew up in the music business. My mother was a professional musician, and then when I was in high school, I was hanging around with all these bands and so on, and in the hardcore scene, and you know, I saw the music industry from the inside and so on, and I even, you know, I had my own fling playing music and writing songs and stuff. And when I think of Paul McCartney, it's just astonishing. There are so few people that you can hold up to Paul as far as his songwriting ability. But then you had, you know, Ringo was sort of like this very jocular character that you could, you know, you just want to sit down and have a beer with him because he just seems like very approachable and very social. So there's the social aspect of the Apollonian. And then you have the religious aspect. You know, George was very, you know, a religious seeker, and he got involved with TM and all these kind of things. So each one of these personalities, you know, these very, very strong personalities who are almost archetypes unto themselves, all express this power, this energy. And I think that we don't see that anymore. And I'm trying to figure out exactly when we stopped seeing that. You know, another band that I would compare to the Beatles, I think the closest analogy that you could draw to the Beatles would be Queen, okay? And Queen were, you know, four singer-songwriters. Each one of them could have led a band on their own, right? I mean, they each had the chops and the ability to write and play and so on. That could have been their own leaders. So they're like four leaders of a band. But the energy was very dominated by Freddie. You know, Freddie was by far, you know, of the four equals, he was the most equal. Right? So I'm not exactly sure that you can really count them necessarily as Apollonian. I put them in the whole, the ancient drag queens of the ancient world, the Cybele priesthoods. But I think most of that is Freddie. But they almost, you know, there's almost a cheat there because in some ways they do straddle the line between that Beatles type of Apollonian, you know, they did all the music hall and so on. And then that sort of drag queeny, very, you know, androgynous energy of the Cybele and Attis cults. Now, just to let you know what that means, people are like, what does that mean? Well, Cybele was an ancient goddess who was Phrygian, which is from what is now modern day Turkey. And she was adopted into the Roman pantheon during the Second Punic War. And her mythology dealt with her son who had, castrated himself and bled to death, and the priests who followed, the priest, it was Meter or the Great Mother or the Queen of Heaven. There were a number of different epithets for her, but her priests and her sort of mendicants would castrate themselves and work as prostitutes, sort of traveling prostitutes, to earn their keep. So that is, you start to see that show up, Bowie, Queen, and Boy George, and a lot of these types of singers as well. But again, with that archetype, there is sort of almost an ambiguity.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe you can call them non-binary or something, because say a group like Culture Club had a lot of Apollonian characteristics as well, very pop, very populous, and so on.
Okay, well let's move again to individuals and people who maybe people have referenced with the Greek god, if only because of a tragic sense, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Chris, in all of this. Jim Morrison comes to mind. Where would you put him in the pantheon?
Oh, he's classic. I mean, he's almost like the foundational Dionysian archetype for the classic rock era. I mean, there's an argument to be made that all rock and roll, considering its roots and so on, could be considered Dionysian. But Jim Morrison, the poet, but there's also sort of like a sexual ambiguity in him when he's young, and then he becomes, sort of portly and bearded, and that marks in reverse the depictions of Dionysus. But it all depends what time period, because you can see statues or paintings and so on, friezes, mosaics of Dionysus, and sometimes he's very large and in charge, bearded and sort of this bon vivant kind of character. And in some depictions, he's very effeminate and, almost, how's the term that I should put it? But when you look at the old depictions of Dionysus, you are going to see his identity shift throughout the different time periods. And it depends. I know that Camille Paglia had written about this. It depends on what's going on in the culture and in society and so on, and how Dionysus is perceived and depicted. And you see that, like I said, I mean, just picture like Jim Morrison in 1966 and Jim Morrison in 1970. They almost look like two entirely different people. But he had that shamanic type of presence, which that's an adjective that people have used over and over again, as well as Dionysian. And he had a great ambivalence towards fame and being a public figure. He did not particularly care for being, recognized in public places. And at one point he had said, I wish we were back in the whiskey. And the whiskey is the Whiskey A Go-Go on Sunset Strip, where they got their start. So his energy is definitely Dionysian. And immediately in his footsteps, we start to see figures like Iggy Pop and Led Zeppelin follow these archetypal and energetic patterns that the Doors set down. But the interesting thing about the Doors as well is that they were much more intellectual than your average rock band. And they had training and background that most of your rock guys who sort of picked up the guitar after they saw the Beatles on TV. These people like Ray Manzarek and Robbie Krieger were people who had been playing for a long time, and they could read music and they could write music, and they understood how it works. And I think that in turn feeds the Hermetic strain, and that really finds its first flowering with King Crimson in the late 60s. So, like I said, that the boundaries can get a little messy at the edges. But you have to really look at what energy does this archetype embody. And I think with Jim Morrison, I think it's almost universally acknowledged that he was a very Dionysian figure.
Well, let's zoom out a little bit, if we may, Chris, from individuals, because this is absolutely fascinating. I'm enjoying it, but we could play a sort of game where I just keep coming up with names and you come up with their godlike comparisons. But what struck me looking into your work was, or what was interesting was this idea that rock music, and it's rock music we're talking about, rock and roll, however people, something that came into popular consciousness from about the early 1950s onwards and is still with us today in various forms, that kind of embodied so much of this ancient mythological ideas and energies, etc., etc. I mean, is this something that is because we live in this time and we've lived through this time? Are there any traces of this that you've also discovered in other popular musical forms that predate this from the 19th century or earlier? I'm thinking, for example, if you look at a composer like Liszt, I mean, there was something called, I think there was a film called Listomania made by Ken Russell, and it was all about how Liszt was the sort of proto pop star of his day.
It's Mozart too, yeah.
Exactly. So is this something we are reading into the whole rock thing, or do you think there's something deeper about rock music in particular?
I with classical, you're talking like a much longer period, hundreds of years and hundreds of composers in different countries and cultures and so on. It's very hard to make those kind of parallels with rock and roll. Rock and roll, like I said, when I talk about the classic era of rock and roll from, say, 66 to 91, 25-year period. And it's a period where you have the United States emerge from World War II as basically the only intact economy and industry. And all eyes are really on the United States following World War II. So I don't know if you can apply that. I mean, can you apply that to 19th century Germany? Maybe, but you've got so many different personalities that the idea of the composer itself, to me, is very hermetic, what I call the sort of the hermetic tradition. That's sort of the Prague and, people like Frank Zappa and Robert Fripp and so on. And I would argue that most composers kind of fit into those molds. And the other problem, too, with classical music is that you had the issue of patronage, where Mozart didn't get up one morning and decide to write an opera. Somebody came to him and said, Wolfgang, I want an opera about this, this, and this, and, say like the Magic Flute or something. Can you write this? And, a lot of these things were kind of done on assignment. So it is a much different kind of situation. But there's also, in the wake of World War II, there were a number of films, most of which seemed to come from Italy. And I think this had to do with like Italy's reaction to losing the war, that they really dipped into the old myths. So you saw a bunch of Hercules movies, and then you saw all these other figures, Samson and Brutus and all these other figures that they would, Machisti in Italy and so on. That were all following that sort of Herculean archetype. And all these movies were being gobbled up by American kids at the drive-ins, the drive-in movies, which was a huge thing in the 50s. So they're soaking in all these archetypes from Greco-Roman world. I have hundreds of those movies on DVD, and you just watch them, and you realize, I believe very strongly, that it had a huge influence that I don't think is really acknowledged or recognized on rock and roll. And I think that was sort of the final linchpin, because you had, the Pentecostal movement in the early 20th century, and then you had rhythm and blues and so on and so forth, country and western, feeding into this cauldron, right, that rock and roll emerges from. But I think the thing that made it classical, I just think about like classic, just what does that term mean? It has an actual meaning, right? It's pertaining to ancient Greece and Rome, right? So I think that the classic era had a lot to do with those films, those like Hercules films. And I would argue that inspired Elvis. I mean, when people think of Elvis, they think of that sort of white suit with the high collar and everything and the Thunderbolt logo and so on. He was inspired there by a superhero called Captain Marvel Jr. That was his hero when he was growing up. So he's embodying like the same types of influences that I talk about in Our Gods Wear Spandex. So I think that is very, very overlooked. And it's interesting because we're just a few weeks out from the release of the Odyssey. So that whole kind of energy is returned again. What they called the sword and sandal movies of the 50s and 60s. So I think that had a huge influence, particularly on the British people. I mean, I just think of a song like Tales of Brave Ulysses by Cream, right? And there are any number of examples like that. They learned, these kids, when they're in high school or grammar school or whatever you have over there, whatever it's called, they were reading Greek myths. A lot of times they were reading them in the original Greek. So there was a huge influence there that gave rock and roll that sort of larger than life presentation. So to bring this back to classical music, I just don't think you can compare the two. Another point of comparison that I think really separates the two is electricity. Rock and roll was about stadiums, and it was about like huge banks of electronic amplifiers and thousands of watts of electricity. Rock and roll, I think, is as much about electricity as it is about anything. I mean, it really is. And I think that sort of stems from, in a strange way, it stems from how figures like Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and all these other figures used public address systems, which are brand new technology. I mean, we have these totalitarian movements without the PA system. I would argue that we wouldn't, but also film and later television and so on. So there are a lot of influences, external and internal, that make it so you can't really compare rock and roll to any other type of music.
No, that's interesting what you say. The other thing which is coming to mind, though, Chris, is that that rock and roll, rock music, however we want to term it, is something which, as you say, it's the advent of electricity, it's the advent of noise, amplification. There's a number of technical things which mean that it is unlike any music that has predated it in a sense. And yet, your basic thesis is that somehow that music it conjures up in a more direct way some of the archetypes that have been with us since the dawn of time, right?
I am sure that if I really sat down with a bunch of history books, there would be another sort of mystery revival of some sort before rock and roll. But I think rock and roll, like I said, there was a perfect mix of conditions that allowed it, television, recording, radio, amplification, all these types of things that you did not see prior. But as I said before, this whole basic need to just let everything go, to just, for catharsis, that's a term the Greeks used. I mean, it means purity, pure expression. And I think that need for catharsis, for release, is, not exclusive to rock and roll or the mysteries. This is why I included chapters on Pentecostalism. Now, if you've ever seen a really wild Pentecostal church service, it doesn't really look all that much different from like a hardcore punk show. It really, people are just running back and forth, rolling on their backs. I mean, just jumping up and down, screaming and yelling. It's all about release. And I think that the fact that it had such a powerful appeal to the working class, I think, shows you that, particularly, I mean, early 1900s, Los Angeles, the Pentecostal movement, you're what, 35 years past the abolition of slavery. So it wasn't that long a time. And it was, conditions that were, a lot of pressure, let's just say, on the working classes, of all races and so on. And I think that expressed itself in these types of, what are commonly called low church or enthusiast types of churches. But when I was reading about that, I was like, yeah, this goes back to the ancient world too. I mean, like I said, with the Dionysian cults, but even, with the Eleusinian cults, which were the cults of Demeter and Persephone. And let me just explain this again. I mean, Demeter was sort of the earth mother, the native earth mother to Greece. And there's this whole mythology where she loses her daughter because Hades sees her picking daffodils on the slopes of Mount Etna and comes up in his chariot and takes her down to hell. And Demeter needs to go down there and get her daughter back. And she has to, there's this whole deal. I mean, but it's something that every family in ancient Greece were familiar with, the loss of a child, and that's why I think that these myths about, losing a child and then regaining a child in some way, whether it's spiritually or physically, had such incredible resonance for people back then. So there you go.
Well, Chris, this is absolutely fascinating, but unfortunately, we have to descend from Mount Olympus back to the ordinariness of life. And so, for now, tell people where they can find out more about you and can find out about your work, especially your work in this realm.
Okay, well, I do have a Secret History of Rock and Roll blog, and that's sort of my catch-all for all anything I want to write about music and so on. So it isn't just concerning this particular topic. I do a lot of writing on just rock and roll in general, particularly the rock and roll that kind of appealed to me, like late 70s, early 80s types of things. But I also, we'll talk about a number of different eras and styles and so on. I guess the best way to find me would be thesecretsun.substack.com. The Secret Sun, S-U-N. And I link all my various, my empire, my online empire, all the different protectorates in my online empire you can find from there. So I've got a few blogs going. I maybe have too many things going on online right now, but there you go. But I still love music more than, I love music more than ever. I'm not really as interested in new rock and roll. I still love the classic era stuff. I'm not as interested, but I also love 90s and 2000 stuff. But rock and roll really isn't happening anymore. Let's just be blunt about it. It's sad but true. But I'm really very, very interested in electronic music, ambient, experimental, even, what people might call new age, all that kind of stuff.
Very good.
Very, very interested in. But like I said, I still do write a lot. I don't write, I haven't written actually. I did an article a few years ago for Classic Rock, but I haven't really done anything for any rock magazines, largely because the pay is so terrible. So it's very, 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 very hard to make any money writing about rock and roll anymore, unfortunately. So it's sad, it's, I grew up with it and I still love the old stuff. I love the old stuff more than ever in some ways.
Sure.
So.
Absolutely. Well, for now, Chris, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Great pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.